Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today I want to discuss an idea so important that the ability of the human race to thrive depends on it. Concept of truth depends on it. Peace depends on it, wealth, prosperity, and in fact almost all human suffering, the eradication of that, depends on it. Now, I'm not interested in clickbait or in popularity contests. I'm interested in truth. And I promise you that if you can make it to the end of this presentation, you will come away with a huge insight that I'll be willing to put money on that you did not know before. Please correct me in the comments section if I'm wrong on that. But this is the most important idea that human beings can hold in mind, and it's the most fundamental. It's an idea that's quite obvious in your daily life, very obvious even, and you might even think that it's unnecessary to discuss it. But caution, we must discuss this idea, and I would say that everybody who cares about the future should take time to consider this idea, because it's an idea that we are constantly invited to deny and to undermine, not openly and explicitly, but by implication. By subtle and almost imperceptible means, we're led to believe in things that negate this most important idea. But before we dive into the idea, I must talk briefly about assumptions or assumed premises that are implicitly contained within ideas. It's really important that we all get on the same page with these concepts. So to start with, a premise is a starting point in a logical chain of reasoning. A premise is an idea that's assumed to be true. It justifies either a line of thinking or taking a particular action. For example, people comply with political rules on the assumption that a rational argument justifies those rules and that their political leaders have their best interests at heart. This is an assumed premise justifying the action of compliance. Or, for example, if you use your mobile phone a lot and you hold it to your ear almost all day long, this assumes, there's an assumed premise there that it's perfectly safe to do that. Okay, if you'd always heard that it's really highly dangerous to use this, you wouldn't hold that as an assumed premise. But we are not always conscious of the underlying premises that we use in our reasoning, particularly the more fundamental ones. This means that we may think or act without knowing the fundamental reason that justifies that thought or that action. For example, we all put food in the fridge so it doesn't go off. But in this case, the basic premise justifying that action is that bacterial digestion of dead organic matter produces toxicity in a process that is slowed down by reducing the temperature, hence refrigeration. Obviously, not everyone is aware of that. So that's what premises are, and we can be conscious of them or not. Explicit premises are openly discussed or verbally acknowledged, but implicit premises are not. So this means that even if a speaker or actor doesn't mention the premises, they are still implicitly assumed. They don't go away if they're not talked about or because we don't know about them. They're still there. Implicit means suggested, though not directly expressed. It means essentially connected with. I think this is the dictionary definition. So an implicit idea is one that's kind of packaged within another, or an implicit idea is necessarily considered true by accepting the main idea under discussion. So if A implies B and B implies C and C implies D, we might accept D as true without any knowledge of A or B, or perhaps even C. For example, a mother may subject her child to a vaccination program without knowing the theory or the set of assumed premises that justify it. She's only aware of one thing at the end, that her child will allegedly be protected. One thing about implications and things that are implicit is that they can go both ways in terms of logical reasoning. And this means that you can trace them back down a logical chain of reasoning, or you can see them as knock-on effects. So if this is true, for example, well, then this must be true in order to make that true. And if that's true, well, then this must be true. So that would be going backwards down the chain of reasoning. Or we can, like dominoes falling, we can see, well, if that happens, then that happens. Or if this is true, then that is true. And if that's true, then etc., etc. The point is this: it's common to have no knowledge of the basic premise that lies beneath an idea that we believe in, or an argument we accept, or an action that we take based on something we've come to believe in. Similarly, it's common to be unaware of the knock-on implications of believing something. It's easy to see the knock-on implications. If you do something, if I drop my coffee cup, it's going to break. But when we're talking ideas, it's harder to see the implications. If you think that, it necessarily implies this. So to put it another way, we often accept ideas without full awareness of the fundamental premises supporting them, or the implications of accepting them. There are many reasons for this lack of awareness of the fundamental premises and implications, but one of them is particularly relevant to the big idea that's the main subject of this podcast. And it's this: that people are quite often insufficiently aware of the hierarchical nature of knowledge. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, knowledge is like a massive and complex skyscraper. Concepts rest on concepts, and rest on earlier concepts, that rest on still earlier concepts. And the whole structure ultimately rests on our direct perception of reality with the senses. So, for example, to speak of orphans implies knowledge of parents, because, of course, an orphan is a child who's lost his parents. Or to speak of bachelors implies knowledge of marriage, the concept of marriage, because obviously we all know that a bachelor is an unmarried man. So this means when we discuss an idea, and those are quite simple ideas, of course, there are necessarily a great many concepts that lie underneath the one that we're discussing. And these antecedent concepts are implicit, just like the lower floors of a skyscraper are implicit when you're standing securely on the top floor. Just as we're not always aware of the foundations beneath our feet, we may not be aware of the concepts underlying the ideas either being discussed or the ones we claim to believe in. Knowledge is a hierarchical structure. Its very nature, it means that it's hierarchical, and each of the concepts and ideas we have are given meaning by the previous, the logically previous, or the supporting, you could say, supporting knowledge that provides the context for their meaning. So just to be really clear, let's concretize this again. If you start a cookery course, you're going to walk through the door with a vast knowledge about all the things that are going to form a basis for that course. You're going to know about heat, the nature of heat, and how it transforms what we call food. You're going to know about pots and pans and cooking utensils and washing up and or cleanliness and all these sorts of things. And they are going to form the sort of basis for your cookery knowledge and provide the context for it. Being aware of the hierarchical nature of knowledge prevents the concepts we use from being like floating balloons in our minds, disconnected from the underlying concepts that give them meaning. So it's well worth developing an awareness of the assumed premises in our thinking, tracing ideas back to the fundamentals, if you like. And we can do this by asking ourselves questions such as, if this is true, what else must be true? That said, what is this big idea that's so crucial for humanity? It's this, that reality is an objective absolute, existing independently of any consciousness, human, divine, or both. Now let's unpack this idea, this worldview, and examine the implications, because they really are big and they're all positive. So allow me to explain. That reality is an objective absolute means that the existence and identity of a thing is not dependent on it being known or believed or recognized by anyone or any consciousness. Things are what they are, irrespective of how we might feel about that. Facts are facts. Thoughts, intentions, wishes, and beliefs cannot alter what is. So to say that a thing exists objectively means that its existence doesn't depend on it being perceived or known by a consciousness. So how do we know this? How can we be sure of this? Well, consider this. Whenever you get up in the morning, when you make a cup of coffee, you know that as you reach for that cup, it won't suddenly turn into a fish, or that when you pour the hot water in to make your hot drink, the mug or cup won't melt. You know that if you switch on the TV, it won't evaporate or fly across the room like a bird. You know that changes are possible to both a coffee cup and the TV set, but you know that those changes will always be in accordance with their specific nature. So if you drop the coffee cup, it'll break, but it won't explode. If you threw a brick at the TV set, the screen would break, but it wouldn't rot into a sticky mess. Now, these things sound obvious and might sound ridiculous, but we all take this obvious knowledge of reality for granted, effectively, and we never question it. But the ultimate root of our certainty is quite simple. It's the knowledge that things are what they are. Now, this is the self-evident truth that everything is something specific. It has a specific nature. Everything has particular properties that make it what it is. Everything that exists has an identity and behaves in accordance with that identity. So to be is to be something, and something specific. In philosophy, this is called the law of identity. A thing is itself. It is what it is. The cup is the cup. The TV set is the TV set. Things are what they are. Now, although this sounds obvious, this simple, self-evident statement is the most profound observation about existence. Nothing is more fundamental and nothing is more certain. The law of identity shows us that reality is an objective absolute. It provides the certainty that reality is a consistent, stable, predictable absolute, existing independently of your consciousness or any consciousness. This is what you know when you make that cup of coffee and switch on your TV set and drive to the shops. Every day, in every action you do, in everything you say, this is the implicit truth beneath it. Now, the law of identity can be restated in a different way. And we can say that, well, if things are what they are, then something cannot be what it is and what it is not at the same time. A pen can't be a pen and not a pen at the same time. I can't be cold and not cold at the same time. You can't be in London and not in London at the same time. We can see that contradictions cannot exist. So implicit within, tied up within the law of identity, is the law of non-contradiction. And this is hugely helpful, the law of contradiction. It tells us that contradictions cannot exist in reality. They can only exist in the human mind, when the human mental map of reality is not correlating with what's in the outside world. If there's a contradiction in here, there's a problem, because there aren't any out there. Now, another idea or law that follows from this law of identity, logically it's inextricably tied up with it, is what we call the law of causality. If a thing is what it is, it acts in accordance with that specific nature. And this is obvious and easy to see, and it's irrefutable. At a certain temperature, wood will burn. At that same temperature, iron will expand, and at the very same temperature, water will boil. Causality proceeds from identity. What a thing will do depends what it is. Okay, if a car collides with a bicycle, it's not a surprise that the bicycle gets hurled into the air. But if a car collides with a train, again, it's no surprise that it's the car that gets hurled into the air, not the train. So causality is completely dependent on identity. What a thing will do depends on what it is. Now, these three laws, law of identity, non-contradiction, and causality, constitute the basis of all rational thinking and of all knowledge. You know this, and you're not surprised by it, I'm sure, because you act on these ideas implicitly all day long in everything you do, from getting up in the morning to taking a leak last thing at night. You have to, because that's the way reality is. You know that when you cross a busy street, you avoid being hit by those cars and those trucks, because you know that they exist independently of your consciousness. You can't wish them away. They don't disappear if you don't look at them. You can be hit by a car without seeing it coming. So these three laws are also irrefutable, meaning that any attempt to deny them inevitably ends up reaffirming them. So the two latter laws come out of the law of identity. That's the big central idea. So the law of identity is completely undeniable. If you argue against it, you intend your argument to be what it is and not what it isn't, or not the opposite at the same time. You intend it to mean what it means and not the opposite. So you're always using the law of identity. It's implicit in anything you say. It really is that fundamental. The worldview that accepts and consistently reflects this idea that reality is an objective absolute, demonstrated by the law of identity, always leads to successful action, because it's the way things are. The worldview that reflects these ideas is the basis of the concept of truth. Now, if you're a truth seeker like me, if you're interested in knowing what's real, we have to understand what the concept of truth itself rests upon. Truth is the label that we give to ideas that correlate with reality. If I told you this cup is bright pink, that would not be true, because it doesn't correlate with reality. So the concept of truth is our means to distinguish between ideas or claims and statements that identify what is real and distinguish them from ideas or claims and statements that do not identify what is real. So it's relatively easy to see that reality is the standard of truth. It's where we look to evaluate and discern truth. This is really important to grasp, guys. It can't be overstressed. Reality is the standard for the whole idea of truth. And it's the objective nature of reality that makes it the standard. And this irrefutable fact is the basis of Western law courts and is the basis for any and all successful human behaviour. So why am I making such a big deal out of it if it's all so bloomin' obvious? And the reason is that the opposite idea, or the opposite worldview, or a worldview based on the opposite idea, hides implicitly inside many other popular and widely accepted ideas, sometimes overtly, as we shall see later on. This opposite worldview invalidates the concept of truth by emptying it of meaning, and it therefore undermines all our human attempts to act in accordance with the facts of reality. And therefore, holding this worldview always leads to suffering. This really is extremely important, because without a meaningful concept of truth, without an objective standard of comparison, the way is paved for contradictions to sneak into our thinking and to be hidden within claims, assertions, proclamations, and policies. The door is then flung open for tyranny and human suffering on an enormous scale. Now, I'm going to go on to explain why all this is so. But successful human action depends on acting in accordance with the facts of reality. That's fairly obvious, which means acting according to truth, which means rejecting and resolving all contradictions. So the worldview I've been discussing is known in philosophy as the idea is known as the primacy of existence. It's really important to grasp that reality is real, whatever men choose to recognize about it. Okay, reality carries on as normal regardless. So what I'm talking about is a worldview, a human understanding of things that actually correlates with what goes on. It's very much in the interests of us men to recognize what is real, because if we don't, we suffer. If you're walking along a cliff edge, you need to perceive the facts of reality accurately, otherwise you can fall to your death. If you're walking across that busy street, you must perceive the objective facts of reality, or you could be killed. So now let's examine the opposite worldview, and let's see why I'm claiming that it's the biggest threat to humanity. And this whole idea is absolutely crucial for the future of mankind and to alleviate suffering and for peace, freedom, abundance. Let's examine this claim. So this alternative worldview, or personal philosophy, holds that reality is dependent on the mind, that it is in some way shaped, formed, or given identity by consciousness. Reality is therefore created by consciousness. And in philosophy, this is called the primacy of consciousness. This view implies that consciousness is metaphysically active. It's primarily causal in the relationship between itself and reality. It means that consciousness can create all of its own content without any prior contact with reality. In effect, consciousness sets the terms for cognition, and observed objects must therefore conform to consciousness. In other words, in one way or another, the objects of knowledge depend on the subject. Now, the meaning of subject in this philosophical context means a thinking or feeling entity, the conscious mind, the self. So, hence, this view of reality is often referred to as subjectivism. Now, it means that reality is not an objective absolute. It means, by implication, that A is not A, that things are not what they are, that their identity is somehow given to them by the observing consciousness. Few ordinary people explicitly endorse subjectivism as a consistent worldview because it's so obviously contradicted by our everyday experience. Most people would reject subjectivism if they identified it consciously as such. However, it is often demonstrated implicitly in people's behaviour or in various appealing beliefs that they've adopted without thinking them through. It cannot be overstressed that the implications of subjectivism, whether held explicitly or implicitly, consciously or subconsciously, are always destructive and always cause human suffering. The least destructive manifestation is seen in the everyday irrational behaviour of ordinary people. So to start off, we hear things like, this may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Or it's all a matter of opinion, and one man's opinion is as good as another. Now, any such sayings that you hear imply that A is not A, that reality is not an objective absolute. So this idea turning up in people's behaviour, without being put explicitly into words or even with conscious awareness, subjectivism exists in people's minds as a sort of subconscious general purpose escape clause that enables them to ignore the facts of reality when it's convenient. It enables people to pursue irrational actions, to make irrational demands, to indulge in irrational whims and desires without being mindful that facts are facts and that actions have consequences. For example, when somebody evades dealing with an awkward issue or a painful or difficult idea or thought or something you have to do but you just don't want to, they do that on the implicit assumption that if it's ignored, it will go away. Any kind of tantrums or whining, complaining or foot stamping implies that reality has somehow let that person down. It hasn't behaved the way it should have, which is a form of subjectivism. Any kind of wishful thinking divorced from action is practiced on the implicit assumption that somehow reality will fulfill one's desires by means of consciousness alone. This is the implicit premise underneath it, even if we're not conscious of the premise. Now, subjectivism has a glossy side, and some people embrace it enthusiastically, and it amounts to the claim that you create your own reality. You are in total control, if not always fully conscious control. It implies that wishes and whims come true without any necessary respect for cause and effect, that law of causality. Just the power of belief, the power of the mind is all you need. It implies that you don't have to bother yourself with any of those annoying facts of reality, and you don't have to offer any reasons. Reasons are unnecessary. In effect, this subjectivism, this idea that you create your own reality, implies that you make it all up. You set the terms. Anything you desire to be true can be true because your consciousness is giving form and identity to specific things and to reality in general. Now, it sounds appealing, doesn't it? And it is. The New Age movement has been selling this idea for decades, advocating that the mind has the power to attract objects and experiences independent of action, to create, has the ability to create reality. You have the ability to create your own reality. Now, it's important to acknowledge that obviously we do have considerable control over our experience of reality. Our mindset or our attitude or our predisposition is greatly affected by our worldview or our personal philosophy, those fundamental premises we hold. And we can choose those. So we have huge control over our mindset and our behavior, the way we approach things, the way we see things. The way our lives turn out depends on many factors over which we have a great deal of control. But this doesn't mean and mustn't be confused with any claim or idea that goals can be achieved without first thinking and then acting in accordance with those thoughts, which is all in accordance with objective reality. We do have control, but we don't actually create reality. It was here first. We arrived into it. There are so many influential and celebrity spiritual leaders out there that endorse this opposite belief, this idea of the primacy of consciousness, that they're almost too many to list. They openly, many of them, advocate that you create your own reality. Deepak Chopra, Peter Russell, Wayne Dyer, Joseph Campbell, David Chalmers, Rupert Spira, and dozens more. This idea is all over the place in our culture. All of these people hold in some form or another, they are preaching that consciousness is primary. In the 2016 film, What the Bleep, Down the Rabbit Hole, they went to great lengths to explicitly justify the belief in the primacy of consciousness by offering allegedly scientific evidence that was simply mystic assertions, and by misinterpreting the results of some genuinely scientific experiments. But the idea is wrong, guys. It doesn't work because it can't. When you're crossing that road, you cannot affect that lorry or that car that's going to come screeching around and kill you. If you don't see it, it doesn't matter whether you have a positive attitude. It matters whether you walk around with awareness. It matters that you take control of your conscious awareness. It matters that you take the trouble to be aware of your surroundings. All these things you have control over. But ultimately, this idea is self-defeating. It doesn't correlate with the way things are. It is one massive contradiction, and it contradicts all of your daily experience. But it does appeal to wishful thinking. We'll have to give it that. So if you think about it, the primacy of consciousness, if that idea was true, if it did reflect reality, everyone would be creating their reality. Therefore, everyone's truth would be true, and no one's truth would be true. The concept of truth would be emptied of meaning. It would have no meaning. Whatever anyone said would go. Contradictions would have to exist. Anyone could create anything, and you could create the opposite. So the law of identity, non-contradiction, and causality would all go out the window. The very basis on which you know reality and operate within it, those three fundamental irrefutable laws would have to go out the window if it were true. But in actual fact, this worldview, this idea, reflects an impossible reality. It would be an illogical, unpredictable, and unknowable chaos. Think about it. You wouldn't know what crazy shit was going to happen next. It would necessarily be a haunted house universe of inexplicable events. If it were possible, which it isn't, it would be the ultimate hellish nightmare in which no human being could function. But this doesn't stop most modern philosophical schools of thought from implicitly holding this view in one form or another, usually under the rebranded and more acceptable sounding name of idealism, meaning the primacy of ideas. Thus, in spite of its obvious untenability in everyday life, this idea has become the dominant philosophical doctrine to this day, and it continues to exert its disastrous influence on Western culture, and I submit to you that that's why we're in the deep mess that we're in. Excuse me. Now, Emmanuel Kant, back in the late 1700s, is often considered the father of modern idealism, with his ideas adopted by many other following philosophers, Hegel being a particular champion of these ideas. And these days it continues in the form of logical positivism, cultural relativism, utilitarianism, pragmatism, and many, many other schools of thought. Ultimately, these ideas also found fertile ground in the writings of Karl Marx, and they led to communism and the collectivist state pioneered by the Soviet Union in the early part of the last century. The denial of the objective nature of reality always and inevitably leads to socialism, to collectivism, and ultimately to dictatorship and tyranny. It is only by respecting the facts of reality that human societies can achieve freedom, as they did briefly when the ideas of British philosopher John Locke influenced the founding fathers of the United States of America. The United States was once the freest nation on earth, and its brief period of relative economic freedom, due to the political freedom, lifted the standard of living of the whole world. The point I'm trying to make here is that on a social level, subjectivism, the view of the primacy of consciousness, inevitably destroys freedom and leads to tyranny. We've seen this happen many times in history, in Soviet Russia, in Nazi Germany, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Castro's Cuba, in communist China. The rejection of the idea that reality is objective, determinate, fixed and absolute always paves the way for political control through the means of force. Because when that ultimate arbiter of truth is discounted, when we undermine the concept of truth, contradictions can be claimed and acted upon with impunity. And we see this happening today. It's been happening for decades, in fact. When men can no longer look to reality as their ultimate court of appeal, when facts are discounted, as they are today, when might logically becomes right, and the ground is laid for conflict, for brute force, ultimately for totalitarianism, the collectivist state, etc., etc., leading to tyranny. How can it be otherwise, if we think it through? When reality is whatever people say it is, there is no way of proving anything, of demonstrating in reason that any political theory is wrong. There's no way of proving anything. Assertions take the place of truth. And again, that's where we are today, ladies and gentlemen. But conversely, when facts are respected, when genuine scientific method is respected and practiced, when no ideas are off limits or hidden from view by censorship, objective reality leaves no possibility for unsubstantiated claims, deceitful policies, or politically expedient collectivist agendas. Recognition of objective reality equates to a respect for facts, for evidence, reason, logic, and thus it serves as the objective arbiter in the search for truth. It can't be overstated, and again I stress, that all of the disastrous consequences of subjectivism, or the primacy of consciousness idea, are consequences of the destruction of the concept of truth. Even if we don't see it, if you don't look around and say, oh yes, truth's being destroyed, these things are conceptual ideas, and these premises and assumptions are happening beneath the level of people's everyday awareness. To hold a worldview that contains the idea that reality is not an objective absolute is to render the concept of truth meaningless. Without an objective reference as the standard, there can be no such thing as truth. To speak of it becomes an empty, meaningless It doesn't mean anything. If reality is not recognized if reality is not recognized as being fixed and absolute, it can be whatever anyone wishes it to be. And it would be nothing to say that an idea correlates with reality. The first question to arise would be, whose reality? And that's when the fighting starts. When people have to battle to assert their to make sure that their version of truth, their reality, dominates, that's the motive for fighting and conflict. Let's remind ourselves that the acceptance of reality as an objective absolute is the only possible basis for a civilized society. Language and communication are only possible on the assumption of an objective reality. Persuasion, negotiation, trade, they're only possible on the assumption of an objective reality. Sports, games, football, cricket, anything you like, these are only possible on the assumption of an objective reality. Where's the ball? It's here. It's not over here because I believe it is. The ball is objectively where it is, and everybody knows that. We must extend this idea into the conceptual, us thinkers, us truth seekers. Peace among men is only possible if we can recognize that things are what they are, irrespective of personal preferences, desires, wishes, beliefs, claims, assertions, or proclamations. Now, this next point isn't going to earn me any popularity points at all. But I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the truth, and I hope you are too. Religions, all of them, flatly reject the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and causality. Those basic laws that enable you to know your reality. Instead of offering reasons for the assertions and claims of their doctrine, religions appeal to faith, the idea that reasons are not necessary. Miracles happen according to the will of the deity, in defiance of everything that we know about what is real. To believe in miracles means to believe that the impossible is possible. Now, it's quite another thing to not understand how something occurs, of course, or to not understand the causal factors that make it happen. Just as natives didn't understand thunder and lightning and had to attribute it to the gods. They thought it was a miracle. Miracles cannot exist. If we don't know how something works, we must find out through genuine scientific inquiry. I was raised a Catholic, and I can still recall questioning the nuns who taught me in a convent school. When I pointed out contradictions or asked awkward questions that they couldn't logically answer, I was told that the human mind can't possibly grasp the ways and motives of God. Don't try. I was reassured not to ask any questions, but to have faith. And that this idea of having faith was in itself a great virtue. That was the path to salvation. Have faith in God. The truth seeker, or private investigator, as I like to consider myself, like any competent detective, necessarily rejects the concept of faith. Faith is the antithesis of reason. It's really important to grasp this, guys. Faith is the antithesis of reason. When you practice faith, or when somebody practices faith in their particular doctrine or their particular story, they are practicing the suspension of reason. And this inevitably undercuts any possibility of certainty in their mind. Faith is the virus that corrupts the logical process of thought and is therefore the cardinal truth destroyer. For centuries during the Middle Ages, the church ruled and mysticism dominated. Faith dominated. Immense suffering and torture were commonplace for blasphemy, for saying the wrong thing and upsetting the Sky Daddy, for non-compliance with religious doctrine, torture. This was all based on faith. Complete political control was exerted by the church based on faith. During the religious wars of the Reformation, men were burned at the stake simply because they didn't believe in the correct version of the fairy tale. Catholics and Protestants fought bloody wars over variations of mystic belief, unfounded in reality, but based on faith. So when you hear religion blamed for so much suffering, or maybe you do it yourself, remember that religion stands on faith, not respect for the objective facts of reality. If we hold consciously the idea that reality is an objective absolute, that's where success is, that's where truth lies. Not fairy stories that men kill each other over. I'm always amazed at the number of so-called truth seekers who profess Christianity or some other mystical form of faith. And if that's you, I appeal to you to question the consistency within your own mind. To hold contradictory premises in the mind and to act on them without noticing the contradiction is only possible by compartmentalizing the mind. This means isolating one part of it from another. Now, Ayn Rand taught me that all thinking is a process of identification and integration. We identify facts and we integrate them into the sum of our knowledge. The fully functional mind is an integrating device, and to operate efficiently, it must remain an integrated unit. All ideas need to influence all other ideas in order to check for contradictions. Reality is one unified, non-contradictory whole, and therefore our mental map and all of our thinking must reflect this. It only by dividing consciousness or disintegrating it can the mind hold mutually exclusive and contradictory ideas. Integration takes effort and conscious work. It takes thinking. Thinking is identification and integration. The path to truth is long and it's hard work. There isn't a shortcut. To believe in a deity or to be a mystic of any kind, remember Adolf Hitler was a mystic. His ideas were given to the German people and they were persuaded by them, not on facts, on mysticism. They all had faith. And look what happened. To be a mystic of any kind is to implicitly reject the objective nature of reality and the law of cause and effect. To hold any contradictory ideas in the mind is to compromise its functionality to some degree. If one particular idea is accepted in a contradiction to the law of identity, why can't another be? And how would you be able to tell which ones should be exempt from reality and which ones shouldn't? The capacity for certainty on any issue would be destroyed. Once the principle of requiring facts and evidence to discern truth is rejected in one area of your thinking, on what basis would it be held sacrosanct in others? If we're truth seekers trying to find evidence of these tiny microbes that cause disease, or evidence that the climate is really out of control due to human activity, we can't say we're looking for evidence in one area whilst believing in the Sky Daddy or any other version of that in another part of our mind. To be a mystic, whether one believes in the supernatural deity or that one creates one's own reality, which is just a new form of mysticism, it's to sanction the idea that reality is not an objective absolute. It's really important to join the dots with this one. And then all of the negative consequences we've discussed. To demonstrate contradictory behavior as a mystical truth seeker is to teach and perpetuate the acceptance of contradictions. This will only and can only undermine humanity's search for truth and consequent achievement of peace, freedom, abundance, human flourishment, the kind of world I want to live in. The truth seeker is a detective. And detectives don't accept things on faith. Can you imagine Scotland Yard doing that? Can you imagine Sherlock Holmes just taking something on faith? Of course he wouldn't. Obviously he's a fictional character. But more than this, no one should accept any idea on faith, whether from a second-hand car salesman, from a politician, or from a priest. The only way to know the truth is reasoning with logic, facts, evidence, looking for proof, based on the irrefutable axioms that we have discussed. It's worth noting that when psychiatrists and psychopathologists describe someone who believes that their delusions and their hallucinations are real, and that any evidence to the contrary from reality is discounted, they call that person a schizophrenic. That is subjectivism taken further than most people take it, but it's its logical conclusion. Anything you can come up with in your mind is true. That's the schizophrenic. These people are locked up. They're put in asylums. To be sane is to be in touch with reality, and that means objective reality. To deny the objective nature of reality, whether explicitly or implicitly, is to invalidate the concept of truth and to disconnect oneself from reality to some degree. Now, I want to emphasize that nothing I'm saying undermines the reality of or denies experiences of mysteries and unexplained phenomena. There are loads of them. I've experienced them. I did fire walking a few years ago. I walked on hot coals of 1200 degrees Celsius, and as yet I have no explanation how this was possible. Clearly, my state of mind somehow affected the fact that I didn't get burned. This needs to be investigated. Also, we know that thoughts can affect the structure of water. the experiments of Masaru Emoto, etc. Now, this is not denied, but we mustn't jump to the conclusion that suddenly the primacy of existence, we mustn't flip things upside down on some small bits of evidence in reality. When I was younger, I used to experiment with out-of-body experiences, or astral projection as it's sometimes called, and I had experiences there that I can't account for. But any such phenomena can and should be investigated, and the truth can be discovered. We mustn't substitute invention for inquiry, and we mustn't make this massive leap to a conclusion that contradicts everything else in our lives. That, to me, is pretty bonkers. We must mentally categorize our conclusions. We have to distinguish between what we know and what we don't know, what we know and what we think might be true. These have to be placed in very distinctively separate mental categories. We have to distinguish between ideas that we consider knowledge because they have been shown to consistently correlate with reality without contradiction, and those ideas that remain hypotheses, which might be true. In other words, it's essential, I think, to have a mental file folder marked unknown or unknown at present. This is the way I manage my mental file keeping. Unknown is just unknown. We can't form any conclusions on that yet. If a proposition or idea is false, or even might be false, it must not be considered knowledge. Sounds obvious, doesn't it? But no matter how much we may want to believe that something is true, we should not act as if it's true before we know beyond any reasonable doubt that it is true. I'm going to say that again for emphasis because it's really important in our daily lives. No matter how much we may want to believe something is true, we should not act as if it is true before we know beyond any reasonable doubt that it is true. We must reach a level of certainty beyond any reasonable doubt. When you make that cup of coffee in the morning, when you drive to work, when you switch on your TV set, you're acting on a level of certainty beyond any reasonable doubt. And it also works for the law courts. It's my standard of certainty as a truth seeker, and for anything I do in my life, if I can be sure beyond any reasonable doubt, then I can take action. Of course, this doesn't mean 100% certainty is possible. It doesn't. I can be sure beyond any reasonable doubt that the sun will shine tomorrow, as indeed it's doing today, but I have to acknowledge that there's a tiny possibility that something might happen. So you don't need 100% certainty, but that's another topic. So anyway, in summary, reality is an objective absolute. It can be demonstrated irrefutably as existing independently of any consciousness, divine, human, or both. To hold a worldview or a philosophy that reflects this leads to successful human action, always. To hold the opposite worldview that denies this, even if implicitly, to hold in any way, shape or form the idea that consciousness creates reality, that consciousness comes first, this idea destroys the concept of truth and thus will always lead to human suffering. It's leading to tyranny at the moment. These days, unfolding in the 2020s, we are seeing tyranny come to pass because truth is discounted in our culture. We live in a culture of we're saturated with assertions and unsubstantiated claims. So I invite you to be conscious of your convictions and all of their full implications. If you're a Christian, if you've been tempted into thinking you create your own reality, question yourself. Think, gosh, am I being consistent? Have I compartmentalized my own mind? Have I disintegrated it to some degree? Anyway, I hope this helps. I hope you've got value from the big idea that I've presented here. Reality is an objective absolute, and we must hold a worldview consistently that reflects that. I hope you've got some value from that, and I hope you've gleaned insights, or an insight even, that you didn't have before you listened to this podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Please comment below. Please email me with questions, and I do hope you'll join me once again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.